There's been some doubters over the years that what is Elon's real end game here with SpaceX? Why did he really found the company? I think the answer, you just have to take him at his word that he did found it to build a settlement on civilization on Mars. I mean, he was talking about that on day one. He talked about it with early employees, and almost every step he's taken has been toward that goal.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Reentry, the new book by Eric Berger, senior space writer for Ars Technica, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched a second space age. Eric, congratulations, and we go immediately to Guadalajara, Mexico. It is September 2016. Elon Musk, a well-to-do success for Tesla, is speaking on his vision for SpaceX. It is surprising in that it begins to sound like the science fiction books that I bought in drugstores in the 1950s and 60s. It's about Mars. What does Mr. Musk tell the room, and how do they react to the idea that he's building a space company to leave the Earth? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. It's a remarkable speech. It does feel very much like science fiction. He's showing pictures of these spaceships, with dozens of people on their way to Mars, symphonies in space, this grandiose architecture with a fully reusable massive rocket. And it was remarkable because, just a few weeks earlier, his rocket had blown up for the second time in less than a year and a half. And so everyone was sort of thinking this was pretty outlandish. And so I think it was a mixture of audaciousness and optimism, to put it politely. There was certainly a lot of skepticism in the space industry and even in the room around the speech. But at the same time, even back then, more than 8 years ago, Musk had a very strong cult following, and so it was in Mexico, and there were hundreds of people cheering and thronging, and it was quite a scene.
What is striking are the details. Not just go to Mars, but go to Mars to live, to colonize. 100 people at a time. To continue, the metaphor is wonderful. The lamp of consciousness, a multi-planet off-world. Why? Because Musk is proposing an extinction event. Is that correct?
I don't think he was proposing an extinction event. He was just thinking about that bad things could happen, right? There could be a nuclear war. There could be a lethal pandemic. We could get hit by an asteroid. There's all these things that could potentially bring down civilization. So he was saying, look, if we're going to be a spacefaring species, let's get on with it. I think what was outlandish about it is that, even today, 7 decades after the opening of the space age, we've put all of 12 people on the surface of the moon. And going to Mars is, an order of magnitude more difficult. It's extremely challenging. It's not a great place to live. You can't breathe. It's cold, right? The soil is likely toxic. But here he was proposing not to send 12 people to Mars for a few days, but hundreds and then thousands of people to live there and stay there and develop a future civilization on the surface of Mars.
We're going to stay with this because there's some details here that will very much explain Musk's impatience and sometimes rage at the slow pace of reality in the 21st century. He asked calculations from his staff at one point about what do I have to do to build a self-sustaining colony on Mars. And I think the estimate is that he's got to land 1 million tons of equipment or supply. As you say, if you go to sea and don't take along the ability to fight scurvy, you're not going to be successful. You have to take everything. So therefore, he's imagining a fleet of starships or even bigger in an exchange of data and equipment for X number of years. Does he have a timeline in his mind how long would it take to get 1 million tons to Mars?
He said before he doesn't think it will happen in his lifetime. He's 52, so he's thinking probably not within the next couple of decades. But yeah, it's an incredible amount of stuff. If you think about over all the years of all the missions that NASA and the Soviet Union and China and everyone else has sent to Mars, we've only ever landed about 2 to 3 tons on the surface of Mars over decades. And here comes a private company saying, no, we're not going to send 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. We're going to send 1,000,000 tons of people and food and infrastructure to Mars. And so that's the vision. And 8 years ago, it sure seemed pretty unrealistic.
Yes, more detail. You need fuel to go back and forth. And methane is the preferred fuel, and there's plenty of it manufactured on Mars, but that'll take a lot of energy. So we start calculating what? Square kilometers of solar panels? In other words, what Musk is proposing is an imaginary world that is it's like Sim City. Remember that old game where
Absolutely. Was a big fan of Sim City.
Where you'd advance. And he's telling this to a room of people who are, well, where are they going in their imaginations? What is imaginable in 2016 for them? And how do they receive Musk's outline for a movie?
I mean, I think that you could find hundreds of people, thousands of people that would sign up for that tomorrow. I'm not sure they would realize entirely what they were getting into. But as you say, it's to produce methane on Mars, it's a pretty simple chemical process. It's the Sabatier process to produce methane from the constituent elements on Mars. The problem is it takes a lot of energy. And I think the bottom line is that, most of the people going to Mars initially, if not all of them, will be on a one-way journey. And so, they will be going there and making the best of it, whatever it becomes.
And what is important to emphasize is not just Musk's imagination, because all of these details are taken from both science and science fiction. I love the phrase that comes up all the time: if physics does not forbid it, we can do it. Okay, fine. Engineering can do these things. What's important I take away from is that he really means it. And this is going to inform every conversation we're about to evidence. Is that correct, Eric?
Yeah, I think there's been some doubters over the years that what is Elon's real end game here with SpaceX? Why did he really found the company? I think the answer, you just have to take him at his word that he did found it to build a settlement on civilization on Mars. I mean, he was talking about that on day one. He talked about it with early employees, and almost every step he's taken has been toward that goal. Much more recently, John, the SpaceX is operating the only transportation system in the Western world that can get humans into orbit, right? Crew Dragon. And they are rapidly taking resources away from that program and putting them into Starship because they believe that is the future of the company. And Dragon, they view that, or certainly Elon views Dragon as, quote, a dead-end vehicle. He wants a much larger, fully reusable system that's capable of getting people to Mars. And there is no economic mandate to put people on Mars. Like, there's no pot of gold on Mars for a human settlement. There's humans going there can create almost no value in terms of economic return, right? There's nothing we need to mine on Mars that's not on Earth. The only conceivable reason to go to Mars actually is to set up a second civilization and start to learn how to become a multiplanetary species. And so his actions over the course of 25 years very clearly show that is the really whole intent and purpose of SpaceX.
7 years earlier, McGregor, Texas. There is no Mars ship. There is something called the Falcon 9 first stage. Eric Berger is the author. Re-entry, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched a second space age. This is volume 2 in Eric's chronicling of the trip to Mars. To anticipate, in the first book, we got to the launch from Kwajalein Island. It's an elaborate story, but on the fourth try, rolling the dice with the last of the money, they satisfied the demands of NASA and launched into orbit Falcon 1, one engine, the Merlin engine, older version. Now we're going to go to Musk's idea, which is 9 Merlins in a booster. And in the summer of 2009, there's a whole crew of young people who enjoy partying and the demands of a Texas summer with crickets and rattlesnakes and heat and squalls. And they are getting ready for the first stage to go to Florida. What is it that they have to do that summer to prepare the first stage? How are they working this, Eric?
Well, they have kind of the first stage, the booster. They have the engines, but there's so much more that goes into a rocket than just kind of the outward appearance, right? You've got all of the guts in it, the computers, the flight computers that help the vehicle fly, because once a rocket launches, no one is controlling the flight of that rocket. It's making all of the calculations on its own. You've got to wire up all of the plumbing to get the propellant from the liquid oxygen and liquid kerosene tanks down to the engines. You've got all of the electrical connections running up and down the vehicle, and just putting that all together for the first time. I mean, this was a much more complex rocket than any of the engineers had worked on before at SpaceX, and so it was just a long, hot summer, and the people who were there described it as the hardest they'd ever worked at SpaceX, which is really, really saying something, because they certainly put people through the ringer at that company. But it was the kind of thing where you take, one step forward and two steps back, because you put something, you assemble something, you test it, you find a problem, you try to change it, and you just continually find, test problems, and try to get to the solution of something that actually works.
Yes, 100-hour weeks are typical at SpaceX when you're crashing a project. And that this project was the beginning. We're going from one engine to nine Merlins, and something called an Octoweb. What was that, Eric?
Well, the Octoweb was the design to basically house 9 engines, because each of these engines is a separate inferno, right? I mean, they're burning hot, but you want to make sure that the thrust from one doesn't, come over to another. And I mean, most vehicles at that time, most rockets had 1, 2, or maybe 3 main engines. And so, going to 9 engines was not unprecedented, but it was certainly a challenge from an engineering standpoint, especially for a U.S. vehicle, which had never seen that kind of thing before.
However, this is a commercial company, a private company. They can't command what NASA can command to move parts of its projects from one coast to another. Most famously, they flew this shuttle before it was retired on the back of a 747. SpaceX has no 747. They don't have a ship. All they have is a very large trailer, very wide trailer, to drive from McGregor, Texas to Cape Canaveral to launch eventually the Falcon 9. It is a road trip from Hades, and Eric, you describe it brilliantly, especially when they crashed into a building. How did they do that?
Well, you had a rocket sticking off the back of a truck. So this was not just a wide load. It was a load that was far taller than any of the bridges on an overpass could accommodate, and it was longer, significantly longer than a typical semi-trailer. So they had to take byways and back roads in from Texas to Florida, and they ran into the most problems in Louisiana. They spent a lot of time south of Interstate 10, which if you've ever driven in that area, you know that the roads kind of are twisting and turning. And obviously, when you've got a super long vehicle, it's very hard to make sharp turns, and so it happened that the end of the rocket was sticking off the back of the truck, and they were trying to make a tight turn into town, and they ran into the inner stage of the rocket into a building.
Yes, they crashed into a building. In addition to everything else going wrong, at this point you say, yeah, we're not going to get to Mars this way. However, they do reach Florida. The first thing they do is vacuum the crickets out of the first stage. We're launched into space with dead crickets as passengers. Now we come to the spring of 2010, and Elon Musk is an impatient man. Remember, this is about Mars. This isn't about proving himself to NASA. However, there's some rules to launch from Florida, and one of them is you have to satisfy the 45th, I think it's the 45th Space Wing.
Yes.
It commands the launch facility. And you have to have a terminator, that is, you're able to blow your rocket up. and then you've got to come to the day of. And I love this first opportunity. Do I say correctly? There was a twister, there was a thunderstorm, and there was a window to launch, or they weren't going to have the power to get into orbit. Was that all that correct?
So what happened is there was a big storm on the day before the launch, and they were unable, after the thunderstorm, some water got into the upper stage of the rocket, and it fried some of the antennas that the second stage of the rocket uses to communicate back to the ground. And it's pretty important to be able to talk to your second stage after a rocket lifts off. So they went out that night, essentially opened up the second stage, and took a glorified hairdryer to these antennas to try to dry them out, to see if they can improve the telemetry or communications with the second stage from ground control. And so the next morning they were getting ready for the countdown, and the telemetry was a little bit better, but it was still dropping in and out, and everyone kind of assumed that was going to be a no-go, and they kind of did this, call with Elon where they went around the room and said, is there any reason, that the flight director thinks we shouldn't go? Is there any reason that the propulsion thinks we shouldn't go, and so on around the room? And like a couple of the people said they were pretty concerned about the antenna telemetry, and Elon Musk heard all this and said, "Well, I'm not hearing any reason why we shouldn't go." So they went ahead with the launch attempt in early June of 2010.
And it was successful enough so that Elon could sell it to NASA. That was the goal, to move the story, correct?
That was the goal, yes. I mean, if you think about it, at the time, no private company with private funding, largely private funding, had built a medium lift rocket like this before, and so it was pretty impressive what SpaceX did right out of the gate with this rocket. Now today it's a little more commonplace because of the commercial space industry that's launched, but this was 14 years ago. So it was very impressive that they were able to put that vehicle into orbit, and it set the stage. It showed NASA that here was a private company with a rocket that could potentially deliver supplies and cargo to the International Space Station.
And that is the new thing in 2010, the new thing for NASA, for the Obama administration, and for Musk's vision of Mars, because it needs to be funded. Somebody's got to pay for this. It's a private company. It's not a public company. And the funding comes from government contracts. Eric Berger is the author. Re-entry, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched a second space age. Not a reusable rocket yet. Soon. However, what it needs, SpaceX, is a source of income to fund all of these madcap adventures to get to Mars, to live there. Now, no one lives plushly for SpaceX. Eric goes through a long list of people who give up a great deal of their young lives. I think the average age at this point of the SpaceX employees is at 26.
Yeah.
And when they say party, that means they go to bed a little inebriated and wake up a little hungover and go back to work for 40, 80 hours that day. And yet they need a source of income to maintain the California headquarters, McGregor test site, and the ability to move back and forth with boosters. Along comes NASA to say, perhaps you can build a spacecraft to go to and from the ISS. This is necessary because, one, Russia, and two, shuttle. Explain, Eric, why did they need SpaceX? NASA, why did NASA need SpaceX?
So NASA, in the early 2000s, was looking for other ways to get cargo to the International Space Station. And Japan had been doing some of that. Europe had been doing some of that, but they were retiring those vehicles. And there was the potential the space shuttle was going to stop flying as well. And so it went into industry and said, hey, we'd like several tons of cargo delivered each year to the International Space Station. That's water, food, science experiments, and so forth for the astronauts on board. Do you think you can step up? And one of the companies that said yes was SpaceX. And so NASA was, provided some critical funding in 2006, and then again in 2009 to help SpaceX develop the Dragon spacecraft that would provide those services. And they gave money to several other companies, but SpaceX was ultimately the first company to provide that vehicle. And it really all came down to a critical test flight in the middle of 2012 when SpaceX had to prove that the Dragon spacecraft could berth safely with the space station.
Musk's vision, however, of a spacecraft is not quite Apollo because he wants a propulsion system on board. Why?
Well, he wants the propulsion built into the spacecraft because he wants to reuse as much of the vehicle as possible. So in a lot of typical spacecraft, you have a service module, and in that service module, that's where the engines are. It's kind of behind the crew cabin or crew quarters. That's where a lot of the power is. But it's also, that's an expensive part of the spacecraft, and the Musk vision for spaceflight is reusable. And so with Dragon, they built the propulsion systems and a lot of other of the systems traditionally in service module right into the crew capsule itself. And they had a smaller trunk, which was expendable, but that, all of the expensive components were not in that trunk. So that just increased the complexity of Dragon as they were designing it and trying to get it, safely into space.
Reusability is a critical detail here. Why? Back to that Mars vision. In order to get 1 million tons to Mars to have a self-sustaining colony, you've got to have a lot of your Grand Central Station of low Earth orbit onto Mars Earth orbit. So you've got to be launching and relaunching the same equipment all the time. There's no time to do new rockets. Reusability of everything, including the fairing. I imagine sometimes they'd reuse the toothbrushes, everything.
They do try to reuse just about everything. For NASA, it was important too, actually, because the space shuttle retired, as you know, John, in 2011. And after that point, NASA really had no way of getting cargo back from the International Space Station. And that was really important because the whole idea of sending astronauts up into space was for them to do research, right? Biological research on themselves, research on plants, animals, all these other things. And when you do research, you like to sometimes bring those experiments back so that people on the ground can study, the product of that experiment. And when the shuttle went away, there was no capability to do that. Well, Dragon promised. It had freezers on board, refrigerators, so you could keep materials cold or frozen, and it was recoverable. And so SpaceX, added that layer of complexity onto Dragon as well, that they wanted to be able to recover it in the ocean within 6 hours of landing so that all of that science could continue to be worked on the ground.
We come to the important test. The first test of the Dragon looks promising, and they have plans for a second test before they try to reach the space station. However, because they're behind schedule for Mars, I imagine, Musk has a calendar in his head. It's not our calendar, it's his. Everything must go faster. No matter what your success is, you're behind. It's Alice's rabbit. We're late. Okay. So they put C2 together with C3. What does that mean, Eric, and what happens?
Right. So SpaceX had flown an initial demonstration mission of Dragon and recovered it in December of 2010. But the real test came with a full-up spacecraft that could fly up underneath the space station and communicate with it, maneuver around the space station, and that's all pretty challenging stuff, especially for a private company. They were working with NASA, of course, but SpaceX was developing all of this hardware. So the idea was to have a quote C2 mission, cargo 2 mission, where basically the spacecraft would fly up to within several hundred feet of the space station, fly around, and basically demonstrate its ability to do proximity maneuvering and operations. Elon and SpaceX thought, well, maybe they could just combine that C2 mission with the actual operational mission, or the actual docking or berthing mission with the station, the C3 mission. So, as you say, they were running 18 months behind Musk's schedule, behind NASA's schedule. I mean, NASA needed these services. The shuttle had been retired, and so they decided in the middle of 2012 to combine those two missions into a single attempt to launch a spacecraft and try to berth it to the station.
And everybody takes a risk on Musk. I don't think it's a product of his charm at the decision. It's willingness of people who are in NASA and people who are observing to accept the fact that these young people have an idea that we have to keep moving. I think the moment that you approach the ISS, however, there are limitations. What happened?
So yeah, I think, now the people at NASA are not stupid. They're smart. They realize that the government moves slowly. And so if you have a private company coming along trying to move faster and do things in better, more efficient ways, it's probably worth working with them to see if you can sort of help them be successful. But they were taking some risks with this mission, and actually what happened was the Dragon spacecraft got to within several hundred feet of the space station, and its primary means of determining where it was, its LiDAR started winking on and off, and getting some errant readings. And so the flight director ultimately in charge of the mission, an engineer named Holly Ridings at Johnson Space Center in Houston, ultimately had to make a call. She had to decide whether she would allow SpaceX to essentially rewrite some of the flight software on the Dragon vehicle, which was outside the mission rules, violated basically NASA's mission rules, or basically scrub the entire mission. And she made a pretty brave call to allow SpaceX to make those changes and ultimately birth Dragon safely with the station. I think there were a lot of flight directors at NASA at that time who would not have made that call, who would not have basically bet on the success of SpaceX.
And you give us all a choice. Would we have made that call? There's no way, Eric. No way whatsoever. You got $100 billion space station, one of a kind, and you've got some people who are rewriting software without any knowledge of what could happen when you redo everything without a beta test. So we come to C2, C3 dock. Now, reusability, that word, that's everything. Musk has a vision. I think accidentally he thinks that a Falcon 9 booster has landed and they can recover it. They can't. It's in pieces. But what does reusability for the Falcon 9 mean? Who's in charge of that?
Well, there's several people in charge of it. You've got people like Lars Blackmore, who's basically developing the algorithm for the rocket to sense where it is in the atmosphere and sort of orient itself for a successful return. You've got Tom Mueller, who needs to redesign the Merlin engine so that they can ignite not on the way up into space, but ignite coming back from space, which is a whole other challenge. Imagine, you're flying through the atmosphere at 9 times the speed of sound. It's the wind is and the atmosphere is whistling all around you, and you've got to ignite the engines in that environment. That's a pretty different place than being on the ground. And so, initially Musk is like, maybe if we could put a parachute on the first stage, it could float back to Earth, and obviously that doesn't work. The rocket just breaks apart. So over the course of 2012, 2013, they evolve a system that they're going to try to vertically land the first stage, and they do experimental tests with a Grasshopper vehicle in Texas, and then when they have some success there and success in actual flights, they decide to start trying to land the vehicle vertically in the ocean as tests. And so, they had some failures along the way, but they were learning a lot with every mission, trying to do something that had never been done before.
Yes, one of the most fun chapter titles in Eric's book is Get the Barge Ready. In other words, they're going to skip a bunch of steps and land right on the barge. Now, we need to mention that there are 2 accidents, 2 failures that very much dominate the conversation between 2015 and 2016, and come to a success in 2015, but then another failure. The details of the failure are compelling, and Eric is a very careful reporter. However, what I take also from the story of the failures is that it's like a blow to the stomach for everybody who works there. They always feel at the edge of failure, that if we don't do everything perfectly, better than perfect, what is Musk says flawless. He uses a vulgarity beforehand. We're not flawless. Not only are we fired, but also the whole company blows up and goes away, and we've come to nothing. Now that's the impression I get from your dramatic writing. Is that genuine? Do they all feel that?
I think that after the failure, the CRS-7 launch failure in June of 2015, it did feel somewhat existential for the company, because there was a lot of talk in the industry about how, SpaceX was cowboying their way to space. They were taking risks. They couldn't be trusted.
Such as C2, C3. That was a risk.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And if you think about it, it was only a year before that NASA had selected SpaceX and Boeing to carry astronauts to the International Space Station. So SpaceX was going to, upgrade its Dragon spacecraft to be capable of flying crew to orbit. And obviously, when you put people on board a vehicle, that just increases the scrutiny by a factor of 10 or more. And so, as I say, less than a year after that decision, they blow up a rocket on a NASA mission, like carrying cargo to the International Space Station. So that just was really challenging. And for a lot of people at SpaceX who had not lived through the early failures of the company, it was this massive body blow. And it ultimately was like their error, right? Their quality control processes, their choice of a material for a strut in the second stage that caused that rocket to fail. So that was a very difficult moment for the company, no question.
I'm speaking with Eric Berger. SpaceX rolls on. However, right now we're getting to where we are with the book Reentry that Eric publishes to help us understand after Falcon 1's success in the Pacific, after Elon Musk becomes a success with Tesla, SpaceX is punching way above its weight. However, it knows in order to win, to get to Mars. That's the idea here. Not to get to low Earth orbit, not even to get to the moon, to get to Mars with a colony, 1,000,000 tons. It needs power. And one of the ways you get power in a space engine is something called densification. What is that, Eric?
Well, densification is the idea that you take your liquid oxygen, which is so liquid oxygen is oxidizer, right? To make a fire, you need oxygen. And so as part of a rocket engine's combustion, you need oxygen. And long ago, it was realized that if you could take oxygen and cool it down to be a liquid, it would be much more efficient because you'd get much more bang for your buck in terms of the amount of oxidizer you could put on your rocket in terms of mass and volume. Well, what Elon wanted to do, and really this was his vision, he was driving this forward against the recommendations of almost everyone in the industry, was to take that liquid oxygen and chill it further. And so we're talking about, almost minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you chilled it further, you could actually make it more dense. So you could put 10 to 12% more liquid oxygen, densified liquid oxygen on the rocket than you could like a traditional rocket. Now, 10 or 12% may not sound like much, but that makes a big difference in terms of the efficiency of your rocket and the payload it can get to orbit, because you're shaving, thousands or tons, literally tons of mass off the propellant side that you can then put into payload into orbit. And so, no one had really tried to do this densification. NASA had looked at it several times in the past and rejected it as being too impractical or unsafe. But here was SpaceX coming along. Now, they just had the failure in June of 2015, and they decided that their next rocket was going to be an upgraded version, Falcon 9 full thrust, and one of the elements was going to be this densification. And so they're not only coming back from a failure trying to return to launch, they're doing so with this really kind of advanced technology of densifying the liquid oxygen and kerosene on board the vehicle.
You note how they're skipping beta again. Okay, now we go to the barge, because the barge is not a minor detail. The vision here is not to land the booster and recover it, bring it back, refurbish it within X number of hours and days, and use again. So it's not enough to get into orbit. It's not enough to deliver your contract to NASA. It's not enough to have a company that works very well in the science reporting, and you've got thousands of young people working for you at this time. You've got to do something like land on a barge. And that, the idea, let's rent an old barge from New Orleans, okay? Float it out into the Gulf of Mexico, and on a stormy day when you've got 5 or 10 foot swells, let's land a rocket on it with fins, and if it flashes and blows up, we'll just wash it off and try it again. Did I pretty much nail that's what they were planning?
Yeah, they beat the heck out of the first barge. They slammed a lot of rockets into it as they were trying to figure out how best to line up the rocket with the ship. That's for sure.
Yes, you're coming back from space. You described the return of a Falcon 9 as 9 Dixie cups coming back in, not aerodynamic. Okay, fine. And you're landing on a barge that's moving, and you're landing there in a fashion that allows you to rock on your struts, right? There are three struts and then you've got to lock it down because it's moving. I mean, it's, tossed in the waves. Then you've got to haul it back to land it, take it off, and a rocket booster, as I learned from Eric, it's very light. And you know how you crush a soda can? Well, it's even easier to crush a rocket. Do I say that correctly?
Yes. When it's not pressurized, it's very easy, susceptible to bending and crushing.
Yes, and doesn't have crickets inside. Okay, so they've got to do all this, and they're not successful in the first several tries, but they keep at it. That's the second thing they've invented. One more thing they've invented now is the idea of, we got densification, we got landing on the barge. You mentioned the Falcon 9 full thrust. What is that a product of? Better avionics, better wiring?
It's a whole revamp of the rocket, and so you've got entirely upgraded engines to get more thrust. You've got the densified propellant to take care of, to improve the efficiency of the vehicle. You have landing legs. You have upgraded avionics to really control the landing of the vehicle. And so basically, it's just a rebuild of the rocket from top to bottom from all the lessons they learned from the first two versions of the Falcon 9.
So they still call it Falcon 9, but it's 3.0 or 4.0. We're headed to 5.0 eventually. So they've got these three elements all together, and they're going to go back into space. They're going to return to space after the accident. Eric Berger is the author. His new book is Re-Entry. This is volume 2 in the Chronicles of Elon Musk and SpaceX. That doesn't say that yet, but that's how I imagine Eric's book standing up for the next 100 years. This is what actually happened on our way to Mars. SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched the second space age. Where we are right now is December 2015. There is a Falcon 9 on a pad in Florida, and it's launching into low Earth orbit in order to demonstrate reusability. That's everything. Reusability not only means landing the booster, but refurbishing it and getting it ready to move as fast as possible. Not once a month, not once a week, not even at this point every 9 days or 6 days, but every 2 days is what they eventually get to. That's right. This reminded me, Eric, of building Liberty ships in the Second War. Started with a month, and you got it down. They could do it in 24 hours to get a ship out to sea. We come to that day of the launch from, it used to be called Pad 13. No, it used to be called, where do they launch from? It's
Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral is where they are.
Slick 40.
Slick 40, yeah.
All right. Slick 39 is the famous one. Slick 40 is next door. They launch a Falcon 9 full thrust, and they achieve 4 things that Eric lists for us, very critical to their success. They're back in flight after the accident investigation. Densification, but a detail about densification. It gives you a tight window to launch once you decide, correct? So if there's any holdup whatsoever, that you have to scrub that day because you have to hit that point or you're not going to have enough thrust. Did I read you correctly on that?
That's right. You basically, because it takes so much effort to densify the propellant, you only have one basically batch before you have to offload it, and there's not enough time to recycle within until 24 hours later.
Is this where it was held up that first day because of the electricity in the air that could cause a lightning strike?
That came later. That was during the Demo 2 mission.
I see. So they didn't have that problem here, but the densification gives you a tight window. The Falcon 9 full thrust, they're upgrading the Merlin engines for this. And they send into orbit, and here comes the Falcon 9 coming down. You describe it brilliantly. All of a sudden, there's this bright light coming down in the heavens. How fast is it moving, Eric?
Well, it depends on where it is in its return. At its highest velocity, it's coming back at about 9 times the speed of sound, and then it's coming down to the atmosphere. It's kind of slowing down The atmosphere is slowing it down, of course, as it encounters thicker air. And then right before, it occurs shockingly late. If you ever see a landing live, I mean, the rocket gets almost to the ground, and then its engines fired to basically bring it to a stop, and then it lands. So it looks like it's coming really fast right up until the very end.
And Eric mentioned before, they have to turn those engines on and off in 3 different environments: space, upper atmosphere, and lower atmosphere. They get thicker and thicker on their way down. And this is all done with an algorithm and a program, or are human beings backup on this?
No, it's all entirely done by onboard avionics and pre-written coding and algorithms that basically tell the rocket to turn on the engines now and shut them off here and all of that. And it's obviously a lot of complex physics went into that.
And the rocket has a GPS in its little brain. That's how it finds the pad.
It does, yes, and that's how it finds the pad. That's how it finds the drone ship. That's how the drone ship finds it, and it's that's how it works.
Remember, on the barge, it didn't work, but this is the day, what you call it, Landing Zone 1, the old Pad 13. Mm-hmm. Now, again, NASA and the Air Force get credit here. They're allowing a rocket that's got fuel in it to come down over some mighty expensive territory. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You have to give Wayne Monteith, who was leading the Air Force at the 45th Space Wing at the time, an awful lot of credit. He had a lot of people telling him not to allow SpaceX to land back at Cape Canaveral. And most prominent, I think, among them was the National Reconnaissance Office, which is this lavishly funded organization in the U.S. government that basically builds and puts spy satellites into space. And they had a multi-billion-dollar processing facility not far from the landing zone, and they were very concerned that sonic booms or other, disruptions from the re-entering rocket was going to destroy or damage some of the precious satellites that they were working on at the Cape. And so he was told by lots of people not to allow it. Ultimately, he did, and everything was fine. The concerns about sort of the rocket re-entering, really shaking things up, were pretty overblown. There was even, one of the SpaceX people told me they had kind of a trailer out by the landing zone with kind of these really flimsy windows, and the trailer was like literally 100 feet from where the rocket landed, and it was perfectly fine.
The risk, again, is assumed by NASA and the Air Force. Note this, because sometimes it seems like the plucky startup outdid NASA, outdid the Air Force. The cooperation between the two come up several times over these last decades. And this is one of those instances where the 45th Air Wing would have been within its authority to say, you're not going to land a rocket over this expensive real estate. And that's China drops boosters on villages. Mm-hmm. There's very little difference between dropping a booster and claiming you missed your mark. Okay. So a detail here at this point that's important to mention is that Musk has now got a booster that works, and he's got reusability, and he's taking on contracts that pay him a great deal of money. So we need to mention the failure. It happened in September of 2016. What is Amos?
Amos 6 is an Israeli communication satellite that was going to provide communication services to the Middle East and parts of Africa. It was worth several $100 million, and it was just basically a private contract for SpaceX to put it into low Earth orbit.
And the failure is momentous because they don't know why it happens. The mystery is that the failure happens on the second stage. The way you describe it, Eric, nothing was happening, right? A car was sitting in the driveway with a little bit of gasoline in it and blew up. That was how they started the investigation. And this was one of those times that Musk indulged his imagination a little bit overripely.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, it was during the fuel loading process, and it was a point where basically, if your car is running in the driveway, that's basically analogous to what was happening with the rocket. I mean, it was not the most dynamic part of the countdown for sure, and within a split second, the second stage blew up and took the entire rocket and launch pad with it. It was a very violent explosion. And there wasn't, I mean, SpaceX had a lot of data because it was on the ground, but the time frame what we're talking about was just a microsecond. And so they really had a difficult time figuring out what happened. And the theory that appealed to Elon most during the first several weeks was the idea that a sniper on a building belonging to a competitor, United Launch Alliance, had shot the upper stage, put a bullet into the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. There was some evidence to back this up. It looked like there was a flash coming from that building from certain angles. In terms of it looked like there was a sound right at the rocket at about the right time. You would expect a bullet from that flash to arrive at the rocket. But that was it, right? And it's really implausible to think that a competitor in broad daylight would shoot someone else's rocket here in the United States. But Elon liked the sniper theory because it meant that it wasn't SpaceX's fault.
This is the same month where Elon Musk makes the Mars speech in Guadalajara. In fact, he does that after the Amos 6 failure.
3 weeks later, yeah.
So Elon Musk has an imagination, and he's a very hard boss. And whenever any of his senior employees called him up, they never knew which Elon that they'd get on the phone. Would he be considerate? And Eric makes the point, if you give him just the details and don't try to spin it, you're probably going to be more successful. Does that work for everybody, Eric?
I don't think it works for everybody. I mean, if he's if he's in a bad mood and you're bringing bad news, I think that there's a chance you're not going to get to present your data. But when you talk to most people, they said that when you go meet with Elon, don't at him or don't BS him. Excuse me, and give him the facts that you know. And what you don't know, and just be straight. And he responds to evidence and data pretty well.
Yes, and we're reminded of that. Remember that convoy that drove the first booster from McGregor to Florida? He fired everybody in that convoy before they reached Florida, but they ignored him. So there's a lot of people who were fired to leave the building. All right, it's time to go to the competition, especially because Elon Musk has to make money or you can't get to Mars. Eric Berger is the author. The book is Reentry, SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the Reusable Rockets. Reusable is fine, but you got to make money. And there are visions of constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit that can provide cell tower for everyone, or the ability to connect with the internet no matter where you are on the planet Earth. Eric and I are conducting this conversation on Starlink. I've had it on my roof for about a year. It works perfectly. It works better than the landlines I have into this building as well. I got it as a backup, but now I use it as primary. There are thousands of satellites swimming above me. You can get an app on your iPhone and watch those satellites swim overhead. This is all Elon Musk's vision, because up to this point, as I understand it, Eric, you're the reporter, there had only been big communication satellites at geosynchronous orbit. To go to low Earth orbit, you've got to put up thousands because they disappear so fast overhead. Did anybody believe him when he proposed this?
Yeah, he was not the first person to propose the idea of a constellation in low Earth orbit, where a satellite basically spends 5 minutes from horizon to horizon and then has to pass its signal off to the next satellite. But it was always viewed as pretty impractical because no one had ever built satellites at a high rate. Like, you would, if you were a company, you built 1 or 2 satellites a year, you didn't build hundreds or even thousands. And certainly there was no launch capability to get hundreds or thousands of satellites into space quickly. So I think while the basic idea was seen as sound, it was viewed as impractical, right? Because it was just too difficult to manufacture that many satellites and too difficult to launch them all and get them to communicate with one another in orbit.
Yeah, the number he gives us in the book is 12,000. 12,000 satellites to offer coverage to the planet. I believe there are 6,000 in the air now. Is that
I think there's the number of operational satellites is around 7,000 and growing almost every other day.
Again, it's a circle here. You've got to make money in order to pay for the building of the reusable Starship with big capacity to carry 100 people at a time to Mars and get 1 million tons of self-sustaining equipment. So you've got to make money, and the way you make money is to put up satellites in a big enough container so that you can put up thousands of them and everybody will pay you, and you continue to raise your prices. I think they've raised their prices a little bit, but it's well worth it. I recommend it to anybody who's not in a major city with a Google pipeline, just next door, which is what you have in New York. So, Elon, everything is for not for profit. That's a puzzling here, because these are young people who are giving up their lives. I notice again and again when the seniors who've been there a while leave, it's because they want to have a family. And SpaceX doesn't give you time enough to be a dad or a mom. You've got to live your job and worry only about SpaceX. In fact, you had one of your informants who, even when he was home, he couldn't get off checking data from back in the office. He might as well have stayed in the office because he was sitting at home, but he was actually SpaceX. So they start to launch these constellation of satellites. They have competition. What is Iridium? What does that do?
So Iridium is a network of satellites at geostationary orbit, which is much higher. Obviously, it's 36,000 kilometers, 23,000 miles, where the satellite's always overhead. And if you've seen people communicating with satellite phones and things like that, that's an Iridium constellation. The problem with doing internet from that altitude is that it takes a long time, even at the speed of light, from the signal to bounce from Earth to the satellite to your phone or device or computer, back up to the satellite and back down to a ground station. And that's why you get lag and the internet's a lot slower. And so putting satellites in low Earth orbit is a lot more efficient than that. It's just you need many more satellites because they're not directly overhead all the time.
And as of now, the system works perfectly. There were doubts early on whether it was sustainability. Kuiper, I believe, is meant to be a competition. That's from Blue Origin.
It's from Amazon. Amazon, Jeff Bezos is trying to do a satellite internet constellation called Kuiper. They've launched a handful of test satellites and potentially are going to put their first operational satellites up in early 2025. But they have a long way to go. They're probably 5 to 7 years behind SpaceX at this point.
And I believe Russia or China are also planning on their own constellations.
China just launched its first satellites for a mega constellation, and I think they may have one or possibly even two. Russia has talked about it. I think that may just end up being talk. Europe just signed some contracts for what's called Iris Squared, a constellation, but that's just a few hundred satellites and probably not operational before 2030.
The reason I'm bringing these up is because this is a startup that is leading sovereign states of great authority, the powers. And they could have done this years ago, but it was Elon Musk who has the vision, who follows through in it. And the bigger boosters, the Falcon 9, what is it? It's called Block 5. That can launch a lot of satellites at a time, 10 at a time. You see a routine now. We're going to turn to the manned space flight for Elon Musk, because that's part of going to Mars. You've got to have a manned spacecraft. Re-Entry is the book. Eric Berger is the author, senior space writer for Ars Technica. I recommend the magazine because it's got all these things I don't understand. I love to read that kind of thing. But also Eric's reporting keeps you up to date on space engineering. Elon Musk at SpaceX is the go-to space engineering right now. Didn't start out that way in the early part of the 21st century. All the sovereign powers dominated space, big space, including the US and Russia. China's the newcomer. There are other programs, but commercial space is now so routine, it's sometimes difficult to remember 10 years ago when it wasn't routine. We're going now to NASA, trusting Elon Musk's innovators on the scene. There's a lot of improv at SpaceX. They don't have a huge number of people to assign to any particular task. When they launched a red Tesla into space, they put a sheet up in the corner of the factory, and that was their secret keeping of the payload. So we're not looking at something like Boeing, but that's important here. Boeing is a troubled company now. Once, however, it was understood by NASA to be the supreme builder of anything we need to get to the moon, to get into low Earth orbit. And SpaceX and NASA and another company called Sierra Nevada that has a neat machine called Dreamcatcher. Dream
Chaser.
Chaser, thank you. We're competing for the contract from NASA for a manned spacecraft. That's critical for SpaceX and for getting to Mars. Eric, you say without Boeing, this doesn't happen. How is that?
Well, NASA was trying to figure out how to get astronauts into orbit after the retirement of the space shuttle, and they were able to get some money. The incoming Obama administration was able to tuck some money into the sort of reconstruction money after the housing crash in 2008. But to get real funding from Congress for the program, Congress had to believe that it was going to be successful. And certainly they were not ready to bet on SpaceX. There were a lot of people in Congress then who did not have any faith in the company at all. And so Boeing stepped up in 2010 and 2011 and said, we will participate in this commercial crew program. We will attempt to build a spacecraft as well. And that Boeing does a lot of lobbying in Congress, and so it had a lot of friends on the Hill. And so when Boeing stepped up, it legitimized the commercial crew program, and that really unlocked funding for it to flow to NASA that ultimately led to the competition you talked about between Boeing, SpaceX, and Sierra Nevada. And then in 2014, there was this pivotal meeting where NASA ultimately decided to go with Boeing and yes, a second contract for SpaceX as well.
Yes, and the meeting that Eric reports on is revelatory of how NASA moves and why it's so careful. It is the government, and it has checks and balances that SpaceX doesn't have time for. And so SpaceX is always, I sometimes imagine it's David Copperfield saying, more please. You know, it wants to be fed more, and NASA and Congress are reluctant, always reluctant. However, they do participate in the building of a manned spacecraft. It is not straightforward. For example, the parachutes. Parachutes, it was a team of young people who went into the desert for weeks at a time, as far as I could tell. And essentially, they were primitives camping out in the deserts of Texas or the Southwest somewhere.
It was parts of Arizona, parts of California. Yeah.
And they were experimenting with parachutes. What kind of experiment? What were they doing?
Well, I think it tells you all you need to know that they call themselves the Chute Show. CHUTE. They were testing out designs, right? The Cargo Dragon came back to Earth underneath 3 parachutes, but Crew Dragon was a larger, bulkier vehicle, so you needed 4 parachutes. And so they were testing out what configuration of those chutes worked, what happened if one of them failed. And they went through a number of failures during those tests, where basically they would do drop tests of Dragon mass vehicles from helicopters, from airplanes at different altitudes to sort of gauge the performance of these parachutes at different speeds and velocities and altitudes.
Now, this is a manned spacecraft, meaning that it has demands that don't exist when you're a cargo spacecraft. They're taking the Dragon design, and they're not going with propulsive reusability, or are they? They do a water landing, so is that understood to be reusability?
Yes, they're recovering it, reusing it. Initially, they wanted to do propulsive landing, where they landed under the power of the engines on the spacecraft, but ultimately NASA convinced Elon and SpaceX that it would take years and years to certify that as a safe way for astronauts to come back to Earth.
And Boeing is also building its Starliner at the same time. And Sierra Nevada, I don't believe, is participating in it at this time. However, there's another craft over here called the Orion. What is that?
So that's NASA's deep space vehicle. It's designed to launch on the NASA's Large Space Launch System rocket, and the purpose of Orion ultimately becomes getting astronauts out to lunar orbit and back from lunar orbit. And when you come back from the moon, you come back at about 20 or 25% higher velocity than you do if you're coming back from low Earth orbit. So you need a much more capable heat shield to withstand that higher reentry speed and heating. So that's a deep space human spacecraft. And with the commercial crew program, NASA is just looking for slightly smaller vehicles to get 4 astronauts to the International Space Station and back.
However, Musk always is, as you emphasize, much of this is this magical character who shows up now and again and makes demands and then disappears for a while. Then you have to call him up and he makes demands after you've been successful. Musk is impatient with Dragon. He's impatient with NASA. He's impatient in general. Does he imagine that Dragon can be converted into a deep space craft, or is that Starship?
There was a time, certainly, when he viewed that. Around 2015, SpaceX proposed actually to use Dragon to send cargo to Mars. It was a program called Red Dragon. And so that would have been a deep space vehicle. And there have been times where Dragon was thrown about as a possibility to actually fly humans out to the moon. I think at this point it's pretty clear in Elon's mind that Starship is the vehicle of the future. And so I doubt we see Dragon in any other capability but in low Earth orbit.
We come to the astronauts. Astronauts are named for the Boeing Starliner. Astronauts are named for SpaceX's Dragon. One particular astronaut is these are veteran astronauts.
Mm-hmm. Yep, all experienced.
Very experienced, and they're in competition with each other at the same time. There's a spirit of adventure that has always been with astronauts and cosmonauts and taikonauts, wherever they are. However, one particular astronaut is keen on winning this contest and launching into orbit, but there's great risk involved in the rocket, in the methodology, in the testing. And there's a lot of drama around it, Eric. Was that known? I don't remember. I remember the event, but I don't remember the drama. Was it reported at the time, the risks they were taking?
I don't think so. I mean, look, there's always risk inherent with human spacecraft, right? Especially when you're flying it for the first time. But NASA does its best to sort of always portray the fact that the astronauts are going to be perfectly fine and safe, and there's not that much risk. And so yeah, I think outwardly, publicly, they were trying to put on a brave face, but yeah, behind the scenes, there's a lot of risk, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And you know, there was, with that first crew launch, as you mentioned, there was a tornado that touched down a few miles away from the spacecraft. They had to scrub ultimately for weather that day to residual electrical energy in the atmosphere. And yeah, I mean, it's just it's a risk, and especially when you're flying a brand new vehicle.
Yes, and the veteran astronauts reported what it was like inside. They're not riding a heavy. They're not riding a super heavy. They're riding a Block 5. What is that? What was Block 5?
Block 5 was sort of the modern iteration of the Falcon 9 rocket that had been optimized for rapid reuse. And so they had taken all of the lessons learned from previous attempts to land, and then after the first rockets landed, they cut them open, they looked inside and saw which parts had held up and which parts they really needed to harden to make multiple flights into space. And so the Block 5 rocket was kind of the output of all of that learning.
In other words, it's not enough to put people into space as a private company. It's not enough to put them into space in a spacecraft you've just designed with people dropping parachutes in the desert. No, you've got to put them in a Block 5 booster that is reusable. So having human beings there doesn't interrupt Musk's need to have reusability.
No, it's amazing. Some of the very first rockets, the demo 2 version rocket that we're talking about, the rocket that carried Jared Isaacman and the Inspiration 4 mission, I mean, some of these rockets went on to fly 20 more times before they were retired or ultimately, as I say, had some kind of problem. So, yes, this was the reuse, the background drumbeat for reuse never stops, John.
And it's necessary to get to Mars. That's to build a
Yes.
Mars colony. We're not talking about people wandering around saying, there's my footprint on Mars. We're talking about living there and perhaps perishing there, reproducing there. Now, how are we going to do that? It's called Starship. Reentry is the book. Eric Berger is the author. Highly recommended to get to you where we are right now, which is waiting for more tests of Starship and Super Heavy. However, they're testing them in a place called Boca Chica. Where is that?
Boca Chica is at the southern end of Texas. If you drive down along the Texas coast, past Corpus Christi, past the ranch lands, and all the way down to the Rio Grande River, it's right at the southern tip of the Texas boot.
I love the way they build Boca Chica. You have a man who's sent out there to shift, what is it, 600 tons of dirt or something that they drop into a swamp to give it a pad. I didn't know that there was swamp underneath the launch tower. Well, there used to be. They dropped dirt in there, and it was too expensive to have a private company come and haul the dirt away. So they rented a bunch of backloaders and did it themselves. That's SpaceX for you. But then they need a facility to build starships and super heavies. So Musk says, well, this is what I want. And they put up 3 tents, 400 by 110, and start building. That's what's out there now. This ability to manufacture equipment overnight at the place of origin. And Musk saw this in one sweep, is the way you tell the story.
Yeah, he saw this in one sweep about 5 years ago, and they built those first giant tents, and then, months and months later, they realized that the tents weren't big enough, and so they built permanent facilities and larger tents, and then they built big, massive integration towers, and so Starship has evolved, or Starbase, excuse me, this facility in Boca Chica, Texas, has evolved over time from very modest beginnings to almost like certainly an ultra-modern rocket factory built up where nothing existed before.
What is Starship? What is it meant to do? How does it function?
So SpaceX has been on this progression. You've talked about how reuse has always been the way they were going to get to Mars. So they started with the Falcon 1, a simple rocket to prove they could get to orbit. Then they go to Falcon 9, which was a larger rocket, which allowed them to do NASA contracts and commercial satellite launch, and it allowed them to reuse the first stage and the payload fairing. They built Dragon for crew capability to understand human space flight, and then they sort of got really good at flying and reflying the Falcon 9. So Starship is kind of the ultimate end game for all of that. It's a fully reusable rocket. The first stage comes back, the second stage comes back. You can use it to fly humans into deep space. It can do all of these different tasks. And it's based on all of what they've learned over the past 20 or 25 years. Now, the problem is that it's enormously difficult to build a rocket that's much larger, much more powerful than even the Saturn V rocket that sent humans to the moon in the 1960s and early 1970s, and then make that whole thing reusable. And, oh yeah, by the way, you're doing this as a private company. NASA spent 5% of the federal budget to go to the moon. SpaceX is doing the lion's share of this with private capital. So it's an enormous technological challenge, and we've seen 6 flights now with Starship. We may see a 7th flight pretty early in the new year as SpaceX continues to push out the technology and get to an end state that's, as I say, a fully reusable super heavy rocket.
And there's one detail here that is necessary because you'll see it on the video of these events. It's called the Chopstick. What is that?
So one of the things they learned with the Falcon 9 rocket was that when you land on a barge or at the launch site, you still have to safe the rocket and then transport it back to the launch pad, and you have to have landing legs, which costs a pretty significant mass penalty. And so they're like, what if we just catch the rocket back at the launch tower and set it back on the launch mount? There's this chopstick things. It looks kind of like Godzilla, and we saw it in action a couple of months ago where the rocket came to a basically standstill position, and these arms extended and grabbed it and literally set it back down. It was one of the most incredible things you've ever seen. But again, the whole game here is to optimize a reuse, and this was a critical step. As I say, you got rid of landing legs and you saved time in terms of preparing a rocket to fly again.
Falcon Heavy is 27 Merlins, and Super Heavy is 31. I don't remember the numbers.
Well, when you add up the Super Heavy first stage and the Starship upper stage, it's more than three dozen or Raptor engines.
Raptor, we're no longer dealing with Merlin.
No, these are more powerful, more complex engines, each equivalent in power about to a space shuttle main engine. If you think back to the space shuttle, it had 3 main engines, and now here we're talking about a rocket that has, 3 dozen.
So let me line all of this up because it's not done yet. They've got other pieces they've got to put together. We have chopsticks. There'll be lots of chopsticks. Right now, there's just one. And you will launch from Super Heavy, the first stage, and Starship, the second stage, into orbit. And that orbit will be part of the ferry. I imagine it's like a relay race to Mars. You launch into low Earth orbit. Mm-hmm. You fuel the starships that are to transfer equipment, tonnage to Mars. And then on Mars, they land, or you pass it to another starship and it lands.
No, the Starship lands.
The Starship lands, and then it's refueled with the methane that you've manufactured in the colony on Mars, and it returns. And it does this every day, I guess, because it takes 9 months to get to Mars, unless Musk comes up with a shortcut we don't know about. And then it's pretty much like Grand Central for rocket ships. The trains are leaving all the time.
I think there's typically a transfer window to Mars where you can get there in 6 to 9 months when the orbits align about every 2 years. And so the goal here would be to about every 18 months or 2 years have basically a fleet of starships ready to fly to Mars. And then things will quiet down, and then you'll sort of prepare another fleet to go to Mars, and then a smaller number of spacecraft to come back. So that's the potential for this pretty incredible scene of like hundreds of ships taking off from Mars, an actual fleet of spaceships taking off from Mars in a relatively short period of time. If and when that happens, it will be spectacular to behold.
And the first stage is caught by a chopstick, and the Starship is caught by a chopstick, and then they're reassembled and refueled, and they take off again.
That is the plan. They've got a lot of technical work to get there, but they are certainly making progress with every test flight they do.
Do they refuel in low Earth orbit?
Yes, the idea would be you've got a bunch of tanker starships that launch from Earth and refuel a vehicle in low Earth orbit that can then go to the moon or go to Mars.
Does any of this require a space station?
No.
So I've noticed that Musk is not. There's a pet peeve. You're never to mention space elevators. Space elevator is not a rocket ship. And it apparently upsets Musk when he hears people talking about space elevators. Is that what they say? Blue Origin is working on a space elevator? Is that what they say?
No one credible is working on a space elevator. I think, a space elevator, if we had it, would be amazing because you could really get rid of rockets. The problem is that it's very difficult to conceive of something working where basically you would have an elevator that goes from the surface of the Earth all the way up to, 36,000 kilometers above the planet.
We're going to Mars. Re-entry is the book. Eric Berger is the author. SpaceX, Elon Musk, and the reusable rockets that launched a second space age. Begin second space age. I'm John Batchelor.